but it's not like this.
With the presentation. So again, we start with Chris. Chris, can you please?
Yes, I can share my screen. And then I will start. Let me 1 second. I'm assuming you can all see it, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I will then start the presentation, and it's time to be 10 minutes long. Good. So hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. I will be talking today about why do we need to consider the time-dependent behavior of rock materials in the field of tunneling, and presentations based on key contributions from these 3 submitted articles for this prize, which I'm very proud of. But first, we need to understand the challenge. And you can all agree with me that underground space has become an integral part of our everyday lives. We use it for transportation, parking, storage, energy, and other activities. But it's time to rethink and reconsider how we design underground structures today, especially when we are requested to design structures that they exceed the common lifetime on infrastructures 100 years, 150 years to 1 million years. And also it's time to reconsider and rethink how we can reuse and repurpose existing abandoned underground spaces if we can prolong their lifetime or sustain our cultural heritage like Victorian tunnels in the UK where I'm based on. And tunneling is associated with failure types, and from a recent publication, we've seen that the most common ones are phase instabilities and failures due to overstressing of support. Others could be fire, ground failures, earthquakes, and others. But those 2, as you can see in the pie, govern the main failure types. And these are all examples from tunnel failures due to time effects. And if we consider also uncertainty that is hidden in geomaterials, we have to understand better the behavior of our materials. And if we assume that we are dealing with 3 different levels of uncertainty from low, medium to high, where in the low we have known knowns, in the medium level known unknowns, and in the high uncertainty unknown unknowns, then considering that time-dependent characteristics in a tunneling scenario fall into this medium level uncertainty, how we can decrease this, increase the low level uncertainty, while the high uncertainty cannot be eliminated. So how we can do that, we need to investigate time-dependent phenomena. And time-dependent phenomena can be either due to a change in the state or a change in the property of materials over time. And in tunneling environment, we can see them as physical responses due to creep, consolidation, dilation, swelling, stress relaxation, and strength degradation. I'm only focusing today on these 3. So creep, stress relaxation, strength degradation. So creep is the time-dependent formation of rocks and rock masses subjected to constant stresses. Stress relaxation is the time-dependent stress decrease, while at least one principal strain is constrained, and strength degradation, the strength of the loss of strength due to time. It is important, though, to highlight that the observed displacement on tunnel wall, where we can see it on extensometers, can be the product of these physical responses that either can act simultaneously or individually. So we need to start separating and understanding what we see in this extensometer. It is important then, and geology matters here, to understand how the materials were formed and how they're going to behave under different conditions, from brittle to ductile materials. How we do that? By doing testing in situ or lab. I'm only focusing on lab testing here. We need to first set a baseline by doing UCS tests and determine the different stress levels like crack initiation, crack damage, UCS. And then once we have this baseline, we can change the conditions, the testing conditions, and then we can see how they behave over time, looking at creep and relaxation behavior. So in this example, we have two different types of limestone, Jurassic and Coburg. You can all see from these two graphs that we are talking about strong brittle materials, and some of you might assume, well, these are not going to behave they're not going to be time dependent. However, through relaxation testing, the observations we made, this is selected result from Jurassic, we could see that they exhibit stress relaxation. We also identify three distinct stages during relaxation, and we defined them. The first one, we can see the exhibiting 55 to 95% of the total relaxation, while the other two are saying the rest of the stress relaxation. And when stress relaxation is achieved, we see that the stress is following an asymptotic line. The sample will either fail or will either achieve axial crack stabilization. If we put all of this testing, the test results into this graph, we can see the maximum stress relaxation due to the driving stress ratio, and using these formulas, we can use them to estimate the different stress relaxation we can anticipate from this type of limestone. If we compare the data with literature review data, then we can start making database, and by knowing Young modules and CI, we can have a better idea of the maximum stress relaxation anticipated. Moving now to the static load testing, where we can observe pre-behavior, like here in a Coburg limestone with axial strain versus time, we can get curves where we can derive viscoelastic and creep parameters. These parameters can be used in analytical solution models. Viscoelastic models can be used also for modeling, where I'm going to show you in a bit. But the other information we can get is the long-term strength. So we have the short-term strength, which is related to the UCS, and this can decay and degrade over time to the long-term strength, and the lower strength limit would be CI. So for limestone, by driving stress ratio versus logarithmic time to failure, we can get these kind of curves, linear here, but logarithmic, right? Logarithmic, where we can use this formula to have a better idea of the long-term strength of such materials. The observations we made from this testing series was that when the materials are subjected between 80% of the UCS and above, there will be an inevitable failure, crack interaction failure. Between 80 and 40%, failure will occur, but in a later stage, depending on the stress level and the mineralogy. And below 40%, there will be no failure attributed. When again we do compare these data set with literature review, we can see that they all follow a general trend, similar trend. If we were considering them into different rock types, we can get again some formulas where it can give us a better idea of the long-term strength based on sedimentary metamorphic Acknowledgements, even for initial design. Astonishingly, here you can see that someone would assume, or it is accepted that granites, most granites are stronger than limestone, at least these ones that we are looking here. However, in the short-term strength, however, in the long-term strength, we can see that this trend is reversed. So the limestone can withstand, can have higher long-term strength than granite. And the reason why is that granite is a polymineralic material, so different minerals, different viscosities, different flow rates that will damage and lead the sample to failure sooner than the monomineralic material of limestone. So this is something to also consider. If we put those all into a tunneling environment, we do exhibit stress relaxation here at the face, where tunnel advances this way. This is a cross section at the face. So we do exhibit stress relaxation, and we have to consider it for safety reasons until we achieve crack stabilization. If we were assuming now that there will not be time-dependent behavior in this surrounding medium, and it was elastic, then we would have underestimated the support and under-designed the support, which would be overstressed and then fail, and even having to deal with these unfortunate situations. If we put this into a numerical framework simulation, we can examine, and right now we are able, with the tools that we have, to consider not only the tunnel advancement and the time effect due to viscoelastic, let's say, models, but also the duration of each excavation cycle. So have a real-time simulations, and we can understand how we can go from the elastic to the maximum tunnel displacements depending on the excavation cycle that we are dealing. And we can do that both for drill and blast and TBM methods. What is important to say here is that creep is starting one excavation cycle after we have crossed the phase, which is something that we saw both in drill and blast and TBM tunnels. So to conclude, I have to say that right now we do have the scientific tools to create practical tools that engineers, engineering geologists, practitioners can use to take into consideration this time effect in tunneling and in geoengineering in general. And I have shown you from the three publications, key contributions, some key observations from the stress relaxation, screed test, static load test, strength degradation, and long-term strength, and how we can consider time effects in tunneling. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Is there any question to Chris from the jury? Any question from the jury? If it's not the case, we go ahead with E5.
Dominic has a
Yes.
question.
Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, hello, Dominic.
Hi, thank you for your very clear presentation. I have a question. I would like that you explain the difference in the time-dependent behavior of your two limestone. What makes the difference?
Of the two different limestones. So depending on the stress conditions, Coburg limestone and Jurassic limestone, these are two different limestones. One is in found in the Alps, and it has gone through a process of sedimentation, and it used to be in a seafloor somewhere, and then when Alps created, this was stressed and folded and tectonized more than the Coburg one that we are finding in Canada, and it is a deposit in a basin. And the difference is that in the stress relaxation, Coburg needed more time to relax, so even double the time, where in the Jurassic needed less. So even in a half day, we could reach axial stabilization, crack stabilization. As for the creep behavior, static load testing, because it was stronger, Coburg was stronger, we needed higher stress levels in order to be able to see the time to failure in the Coburg. And that's, but it wasn't, and also needed more time to fail. So again, similar observations, because they was less disturbed, I would say, than the Jurassic, and also a little bit different in the mineralogy. So there will be some difference. But overall, as a limestone, it's a strong material, and somebody might not think that could experience time-dependent behavior, but it does, and it's something that we need to take into consideration in the design, as I mentioned.
Thank you. So you would take the sections through both sandstone. You could already figure out that you would have such a different time dependency or not?
Excuse me, could you repeat your questions?
Yes. If you would make thin sections, through your limestones, could you already, based on your observation of the microstructure, figure out that you have a difference in time dependency behavior?
That's a good question, but I wouldn't say that you can be confident as looking at you can assume perhaps if there's a big difference in mineralogy, but you wouldn't be able to say just from the mineralogy how they're going to behave. I think you need to also know the geological history of each material and try to understand where they came from, and then how can be again disturbed in order to be more confident in your assumption. However, the best way to find out is doing the testing, and we need to do the testing even if they take some time because they're time dependent. And but it can give a lot of information about how they can behave, and we shouldn't just design our geostructures these days only by looking short-term properties.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Then we can go ahead with the second presentation. If I could, please go ahead.
Hello, can anyone hear? Can Professor Azar hear me? And anyone can hear me? So is my voice now then clear?
Yes, clear.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
so
we
much.
can hear you. Please.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Azam, and good morning and good afternoon. So I'm very much appreciate the opportunity provided by the IAEG. And my presentation title is the investigation, the mechanism of soil internal erosion. So I will divide my presentation into three main parts. The soil internal erosion is a fundamental problem in engineering geology. Here we can see the many geological hazards like landslide, debris flow, and engineering accident like piping in the Earthfield Dam. Although each disaster has its own initiation factors, the common mechanism of soil failure is the internal erosion. Internal erosion refers to the migration of fine particles caused by seepage force or fluid flow. The interaction between the fluid and soil is the most critical physical process. Therefore, from the theoretical point of view, challenges lies in how we simulate the particle-fluid interaction. From experimental point of view, can we also develop a physical model to detect high-definition internal imaging to monitor the particle migration? To tackle the above scientific challenges, we proposed several objectives from both theoretical and physical side, considering the pore structure, solid fluid coupling, fine migration mechanism, and engineering application. I will first start the achievement by introducing the structure of the soil pore. To study the micropore structure of a typical source material of geohazards, we collected soil samples on site. Then we used the ST method based on SEM to build the pore structure in this study. We consider three indicators of pore structure: pore complexity, 3D unit number, and pore frequency distribution. We then perform a clogging probability analysis. The result shows that the clogging probability will increase with the increase of pore complexity and decrease of the 3D unit number. For the theoretical development, I will first introduce the categories of solid fluid coupling analysis. Based on the difference of boundary condition, two categories are identified. The key coupling process is the particle displacement, soil structure variation, and fluid flow change or pore pressure change. Therefore, the core challenges are how to accurately apply the permeability coefficient and how to apply pore pressure to the solid particles. We first start with the solid fluid deformation coupling. When the sample is subjected to the isotropic compression, the volume reduction in the pore space will cause excess pore water pressure to build up. Therefore, we introduce a virtual water element to carry pore pressure. The water particle stiffness is then calculated by the compressibility of the water. During the diffusion process, the effective stress is carried by the solid particle and pore pressure is carried by the water particle. Here, we reduce the water particle stiffness in a certain amount to maintain the expected volume reduction. For high solid concentration flowing, the continuity equation for fluid flow is expressed as the mass conservation. By combining the Darcy's equation and the compressibility of the fluid pressure can be solved at grid point of each mesh element. To update the permeability, we determine the number of the particles in the region. If no particle migration is found, the permeability is updated based on the volumetric strain using the modified version of the Koselny-Kármán equation. On the other hand, the permeability is updated based on the measured porosity of the element. Internal erosion actually is a complicated continuous process which involves the particle migration and also the pore clogging and the continuous washout. And all this process will further affect the background mechanical behavior of the soil. However, the non-transparent nature of the soil media make it difficult to study the migration of fine particles in soil. To solve the problem, we developed a seepage device to observe particle migration. We perform 1D seepage test by controlling the coarse particle size. We use the Bin 9 station in Shanghai Spectrum Radiation Facility used for medical science. The spatial resolution of the CT scan was set as 9 micrometer to make sure pore structure can be reviewed. For the numerical simulation followed by the experimental study, we choose the DM fluid flow coupling for the macro scale and the DM LBM coupling for the micro scale simulation. According to the CT scan-based reconstruction, after the statistical analysis, we found that the pore shape can be simply described as an inlet diameter, the outlet diameter, and also the pore length. So we further use the LBM-DM method to simulate the particle migration process in a single pore to find out the effect of the shape indicator. For continuous washout, we observe that the particle kinetic energy difference as the decaying transcendental function before the particle entering the pore. When the particle moving inside of the pore and the correlation between the particles lead to a sudden drop of the velocity, and which hinders the fluid migration and lead to the increase of the fluid pressure on the both sides and increase of the particle velocity. When the particle leave the pore, the kinetic energy increase with the increase of the fluid velocity. The smaller the outlet diameter is, the more the intense of particle kinetic energy variation will be. For pore clogging case, it is observed that the clogging is mainly controlled by the pore size and pore length. Based on the maximum contact force and force chain characteristics, the clogging is divided into 3 types, say single arch, double arch, and dome. Based on the CT result, we observe the cross-sectional degree of erosion on the different coarse particles. Larger coarse particle size give a quick erosion of the top. However, the smaller coarse particle size give a progressively stripping erosion. In order to further clarify the dynamic characteristics of the eroded particles, we simulate the whole process using the solid fluid flow coupling method. The comparison of the CT and the numerical simulation results shows almost the same erosion ratio, which shows the capability of the numerical model. We also found that the larger the average pore to fine diameter ratio is, and the greater the probability of the particles passing through the pore. And the fluctuation of the particle transport will first increase and then go to a decreased state, and which will cause the pore pressure to increase and soil strength to decrease. For the engineering application, we use flood model under the rainfall infiltration condition to study the initiation process of the slope failure. We identified that some soil pores are blocked by the migrated fine particles. The fine particles accumulated at certain layer and form a relatively impermeable layer, and the pore pressure will increase and the soil strength decrease, and we will observe the subsequent soil failure. Meanwhile, We also apply our developed numerical method on sand production analysis in the petroleum engineering. We simulated the sanding on the hollow block sample. We identified the best fluid flow and stress condition and report the result to the British Petroleum to achieve efficiency wellbore production. Here is the conclusion of the achievement. By using the constructed Pore indicator and newly developed numerical method, we explain the process and dynamic mechanism of the fine particle migration and apply our own knowledge to the other engineering field. So we have totally published 40 ESI papers, including 5 ESI highly cited paper and 1 hard paper of wellbore science, awarded as the leading technology by China Association of Science and Technology, and outstanding reviewer of computers and geotechnics. The achievements are also recognized by the international experts, including Professor Wolkenstoffer from Swansea University of Technology, Professor Li from the University of Hong Kong, Professor Kodikara from the Monash University, and Professor Wang from Kyoto University. The main disadvantage of the DEM is the overburden calculation when approaching to the size scale. Therefore, in the future research, we will focus on the hydraulic and mechanical constitutive modeling, considering the micro and macro scale coupling. We will combine microscale numerical analysis with test data, use the machine learning to build a nonlinear mapping between the soil deformation and fine particle migration. We hope that we can provide the new method under the continuous serial analysis framework. Thank you so much. And here is the end of my presentation. Just wonder if there's any questions. We'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the jury? Any questions from the jury? Maybe I have a question, just asking if we have some cementation in the sedimentary rocks. How is the influence of that with regard to the flow characteristics?
Okay. Cementation of the fine particles is not studied in our previous work, but actually we have considered the cementation in our recent research work. So let me share the screen and give you a. Here is the particle that passing through the pore, and if with the cementation we find that after the arching is already formed, and the time for the arching to be destroyed will be longer than if the particle is not with the cementation. So the cementation of the LBM-DM modeling is just adding the segment between the particle boundaries and to form a segmented particle. So this is very familiar in the DEM study, which is called the segmented boundary or the cohesion or the parallel boundary. So we can add to that. So I think this is a very good opportunity for our future study.
Okay, thank you very much. We move forward to the next speaker, Brandon Jones. Do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, you can go ahead.
Can you see my slides? Okay, everyone can see my slides and hear me just fine? I assume so. So my research for my PhD looked at variably saturated fracture flow with the aim of contributing via a series of experimental models to unsaturated rock masses, which is also known as the fractured vadose zone. Let me just say. So just a little bit of a background. The movement of water in this fractured vadose zone is very complex and primarily is governed by the interaction between gravitational and capillary forces together with surface tension, some viscous forces. We also have small scale variations in our actual geometry of the fractures, which influences it. And that leads to several types of flow mechanisms and flow regimes that we see within the fractured vadose zone. Now, remember when we collect data for our rock mass models, we tend to go into a lot of detail in describing our discontinuities, and this helps us infer strengths, better define the strength of the rock mass. But for groundwater, we tend not to do that. In current practice, groundwater assessments are really based on a simplified bulk system. And what that means is that we tend to view the entire system in terms of fracture networks. We look at compartmentalization, we focus on flow boundaries. When we talk about discrete fractures within that system, we oversimplify to the smooth parallel plates. And that just shows you what it is there. Flow through a discrete fracture is simplified to the smooth parallel plates. And water flow is quantified using the cubic law, which assumes that these parallel plates are impermeable. And then the flux is proportional to the cube of the fracture aperture. So for many applications in the fractured vadose zone, we need to better characterize our rock masses and the implications that variable moisture has on our projects. And this will start at the discrete fracture scale, which will hopefully ultimately lead to an improvement of our conceptual models that are consistent with real-world flow examples, flow processes that we observed. So the ultimate aim was to advance the conceptual understanding of this variably saturated flow through discrete open discontinuities, and in terms of its application and its applicability to engineering applications. The research was primarily split into two portions. The first was a case study from a newly constructed dam site in South Africa. And what we did there was look for field permeability relationships. Those field permeability relationships were then used as input answers to guide a series of physical models in the laboratory. So they led to us looking at some flow visualization experiments and better understanding flow through discrete fractures. Obviously, due to time constraints here, I am only presenting selected experiments, and everyone is referred to the publications later for any details that they may have or may want. So what about the field relationships? Well, let's quickly give a bit of a brief overview of what the case study was. So we used investigation and construction data from De Hoop Dam. The dam itself the dam wall is about 1 kilometer long. At its highest point, it's about 80 meters high. It's a roller compacted concrete gravity dam. The engineering geology of the dam consists mostly of gabbronorite. It's located within the Bushveld igneous complex in South Africa, which is one of the largest layered intrusive complexes in the world. A lot of platinum mining takes place within that Bushveld complex. And the structure of the foundation rock mass was largely controlled by a regional fault that runs about 500 meters north of the site. And that really dictated that sort of structure that we see there. Typically, there were three prominent joint sets. There was a sub-horizontal joint set, which was due to that stereotypical layering of the Bushveld igneous complex that we get, but also to some degree, some stress relief joints from that lithostatic unloading. Then there were two sub-parallel joint sets. Joint set 3 there was parallel to that, or subparallel to that larger regional fault, whereas joint set 2 was oblique to that fault. In general, the rock mass quality improved towards the river section, and an associated decrease in the permeability. There were localized poorer zones around the river, obviously, associated with some large-scale faulting and some dolomite intrusions. But overall, in general, rock mass conditions increased from the upper left flank, so just upper left flank over here through to the lower left flank and then to the river, with some, like I say, with some localized poor conditions. So what were the relationships that we identified? Well, there were two very important relationships that we thought we need to target going forward. So one was the influence of defect orientation. So we looked at the permeability data from the Erosion testing in the investigation phase, as well as during the construction phase, which preceded grouting. There was foundation mapping available to us. We obviously had boreholes from the investigation phase, and then all the grouting data. So a comparison of those data sets largely found that foundation blocks where there were prominent vertical sets present in the block had a poor correlation between those data sets, and generally had an unsuccessful primary grout hole. Whereas foundation blocks that had predominantly horizontal or prominent horizontal joint sets had a good correlation between the permeability and grout data, and the primary grout hole was generally a success. So what did that mean? Sorry, just before I move on, what did that mean? Does that mean that we need to start thinking about what the influence of the defect orientation has on permeability assessments in unsaturated rock masses? The second field relationship that we identified was the influence of the degree of saturation. If you just look here, this is a graph of permeability during Erosion tests against grout take in the upper left flank through to the river section over here. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a correlation towards that river section. Now, the other correlation that we had towards the river section was that there was an increase in the degree of saturation. So in the lower, or the sort of definitely the mid to upper flanks, we had a dry rock mass and not a lot of moisture, but progressively as you move towards the river section, the moisture conditions increased. So was that telling us that those correlations telling us that there was something to be investigated there? Now, just a point of clarification, obviously this type of project is very nuanced in terms of what can cause these correlations, but we really wanted to look at these potential trends and start testing them within this, what was an initially unsaturated rock mass, which after reservoir impoundment became saturated, particularly that they had some leakage problems that needed remediation in that upper left flank, the mid to upper left flank, where conditions were initially unsaturated. So based on those field relationships, we wanted to specifically target those questions. So because unsaturated fracture flows is a fairly poorly understood topic, it made some strides at the Yucca Mountain nuclear storage facility up until about the mid-2000s, then it tapered off, and really in the last 5 to 8 years, it's kind of picked up again. So we really went back to basics, looking at smooth parallel plates and the influence of unsaturated conditions of those. So we want to look at the influence of orientation. So we had horizontal and vertical fractures in our experiments and the applicability of the cubic law. Then we also looked at conducting Erosion tests under the influence of partial saturation and how that flow can be described. There were a series of other tests. We looked at fracture intersections. We incorporated some contact obstacles, but largely they corroborated these tests. So I won't go into those for the sake of time. Just in terms of the Erosion test, that was our conceptualized model. So we really tried to mimic a packet testing interval with a discrete fracture intersecting its base. The materials were made of, we used transparent acrylic plexiglass sheets. That was to isolate unsaturated flow dynamics. The fractures were open, no geometrical complexity at all, no infill. And some of the key findings here were that vertical fractures didn't readily achieve full saturation, and they were predominantly, the cross-sectional area of those vertical fractures were predominantly, within the minority of the cross-sectional area, comprised of preferential flow. So we had low degree of saturations in all of the vertical fractures that we tested. So if you look at this example here, which is a increasing flow rate from left to right. So we can see that there's preferential flow in that vertical fracture. There are rivulets, there's oscillating rivulets as we increase the flow rate. There's some film flow, which are typical unsaturated flow mechanisms that we expect. And the oscillating rivulets and that wavy film flow indicates some tortuosity within the flow path. And the vertical fracture didn't saturate despite being fed from a saturated horizontal fracture. So did that mean too that we need to consider something like the continuity principle, where we have vertical flow occurring at much higher fluxes given that low degree of saturation? We have a full width horizontal fracture that's saturated, that same volume of water needs to be transported in the vertical fracture at lower degrees of saturation. So the linear velocity must be driven up to accommodate that decrease in saturation. And most importantly, the cubic law assumptions in this case are invalid, but yet there's no proposed alternative. Moving on to some of the findings from the Erosion tests at partial saturation. We'll see here's just an example from one of the tests that were conducted on an inclined fracture, a single discrete inclined fracture with 0.5 millimeter aperture. Again, it was not fully saturated as we increase our ascending pressure levels to Pmax and then subsequently decrease them. If we plot our Erosion test graph, we can see that we would have called a turbulent flow behavior when interpreting Erosion tests. Now, turbulent flow is typically associated with geometrical complexities within the fracture and within the rock mass by the formation of eddies. But what this told us is that perhaps that partially saturated conditions can also contribute or compound the turbulence of fluid flow. Looking at the pressure versus flux diagram, you can see that flow is highly nonlinear. And so what did we do to describe that? Well, the Forchheimer law has been used to describe fluid flow. You can see there, Forchheimer law basically has a linear and a nonlinear component, unlike the cubic law, which is a form of the Navier-Stokes form of differential equations, but this allows for consideration of the nonlinear component from the geometrical complexities of the fractures itself. So calculated flows using the Forchheimer law compared very well to our measured flow rates in the laboratory. What are the implications of this? Well, first is obviously the presence and interaction with these preferential flow paths and excavations within our projects. But most importantly, in terms of our site characterization and really defining our engineering geological model. So if we are testing within the unsaturated zone or within that fractured Vadose zone, if we consider that we have a discrete unsaturated fracture that is essentially exhibits this turbulent flow behavior, well, we'll assign a Erosion value and under those partially saturated conditions. But if we come back and that same fracture is considered fully saturated, we're likely to see a bit more what we term laminar flow. So we may assign a Erosion test that's higher under that same fracture being saturated. So there's this ambiguity in our flow behavior and assigning our Erosion value. If we consider the same scenario, we're doing the PQ diagram. Let's assume we go out and do our site investigation and we conduct our Erosion tests on a discrete fracture that is initially unsaturated. We may get this nonlinear flow due to those two-phase conditions. And we may assign or calculate a partially saturated flux that may occur under a given hydraulic head. So if this was for our dam site, for instance, and we were investigating it, we may conduct this at the expected pressure head of the dam. But upon reservoir impoundment, we may start to get linear flow, and that flux at saturated conditions is much higher. So is this leading us to incorrect quantification of the flux over the project life cycle? So just to conclude, I must firstly, with all research, there is definitely a way forward, and that is primarily driven by the limitations and assumptions of this work that was done. So what we'll need to do is progressively incorporate natural fracture properties and complexity, which has to some extent already been done and is continued to be doing so, and that's looking at those contact obstacles, roughness, different material properties, infill. We'll need to link processes at different laboratory scale, from small scale to meso scale laboratory experiments, and then further link that to our field processes by conducting larger controlled field experiments. and looking at discrete defects through to the fracture network. And all of these need to be done at varying flow conditions. So in conclusion, how water moves through our discrete fractures at partial saturation is very much understated. We need more emphasis on these preferential flow paths that are driven by their linear velocities. We need more studies that require us to get this unified view of unsaturated flow dynamics. We need to isolate each of these individual processes and link the two of them, because ultimately building a suitable representation of a realistic fracture system is very difficult. But this research has at least showed some preliminary answers to explain flow deviations from common saturated approaches, which are shown to be incorrect, and that flow mechanisms within the fracture beta zone are very complex. Our bulk systems approaches do not contribute to fundamental research, and really we require deeper understanding of small scale processes. And the implications of these complex moisture dynamics in the fractured beta zone affect projects throughout their life cycles. So just lastly, some acknowledgements to Professor Van Rooij and Professor Dippenaar at the University of Pretoria, to the funding I received from the WRC and the NRF, to my firm PSM, as well as Mark Eggers, the Australian Geomechanics Society, as well as the IAEG. There are some of the publications where you can refer to for details of these experiments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Any questions from the jury? If not the case, I have one question. Your Lojong values, for what time of injection do you have? Because the time of injection is important with regard to the saturation on one side. Yes. And it's also interesting and important for the aperture, because the bigger the aperture is, the more water will flow, especially at that place or through this aperture. So yes. What is the relationship between both?
So look, we didn't investigate that within the case study itself, but yes, of course, conducting Lujon tests, you do tend to clean the hole and saturate the rock mass at least around the borehole before conducting it. But it's really understanding those preferential flow paths that you talk about that are controlled by primarily that fracture aperture. So as soon as we have a larger or increased fracture aperture, it's our gravitational forces that start to dominate as opposed to the capillary forces. So to go back to your question, the Lujon testing time in the case study was 10 minutes per stage. Yeah, so yes, there was a lot of nuance around the case study, which is a given due just to the complexity of dam and any ground project. But in terms of the testing that we then used to investigate the potential impact of conducting these tests under partial saturation, I mean that we ran for that would have been sort of 15 minutes per stage.
Because we have in Germany a recommendation to use 20 minutes at least, okay. Because this is not perfect, but it's still okay.
Yeah.
For that. That's but why
see,
I asked.
Even if you, the theory goes that even if you increase in the time, because that preferential flow path has already been established, flow will occur along that flow path.
Of course. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. No other questions? Okay, thank you, Brandon. Thank you. Thank you all for your contribution. I think we come to the end. So maybe we will release you. You can, all candidates can just shut down the connection, because we have to discuss now in the jury about your work. You have all delivered excellent presentations. I personally will have a big problem to choose one, but I think we have to. And thank you again See you then.